1. Early life and youth, 1889 to 1913. Birth and family background. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small town in Austria-Hungary, now Austria. He was the fourth of 6 children born to Alois Hitler and Clara Pölzl. His father Alois was a customs official and a strict, authoritarian figure, while his mother Clara was much more nurturing and affectionate. The family experienced frequent moves due to Alois's career, which led to a relatively unstable and often strained childhood for Adolf. Adolf's early years were marked by the loss of several siblings at a young age, which undoubtedly had a profound impact on him. By the time he was born, only one of his siblings, his older sister Paula, had survived. His father's authoritarian nature created a tense household environment, with Alois often imposing harsh discipline on his children. The relationship between Adolf and his father was particularly difficult, with Adolf frequently rebelling against his father's authoritarianism. Relationship with parents. While Alois Hitler was a strict and somewhat distant father, Adolf's relationship with his mother Clara was far more affectionate. Clara was reportedly loving and supportive, and Adolf, in turn, seemed to have a deep attachment to her. This relationship would become even more significant later in his life, particularly as his mother's death from cancer in 1907 left him devastated. Adolf's attachment to his mother and his feelings of abandonment after her death would play an important role in his personal and emotional development. Alois Hitler's authoritarian personality clashed with Adolf's more independent and rebellious nature. Adolf wanted to pursue a career in the arts, a passion that had developed during his childhood, but his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps and become a civil servant. The constant conflict between father and son led Adolf to distance himself from Alois and seek a path of his own, even though he would not find the support he needed for his artistic ambitions. Education and artistic aspirations. Adolf's academic career was unremarkable. He was a poor student who struggled in school, particularly with subjects that required logical reasoning or scientific understanding. However, he showed a keen interest in art and architecture, spending much of his time drawing and painting. His artistic inclinations led him to apply to the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna in 1907, but his application was rejected twice in 1907 and 1908. This rejection, combined with his failure to gain admission to a secondary school, led to a deep sense of disappointment and anger in young Adolf. He blamed others, particularly the educational institutions, for not recognizing his talent, which further fueled his sense of resentment and victimhood. During this period, Adolf lived in Vienna, a city that would become the focal point of his ideological development. Vienna at the time was a city in turmoil, with tensions between various ethnic groups, economic instability, and political unrest. It was here that Hitler was exposed to extreme nationalist ideas and anti-Semitic sentiments, which would play a crucial role in shaping his future worldview. Life in Vienna and early ideological influences. While living in Vienna, Adolf Hitler struggled with poverty and homelessness. He moved between various boarding houses and shelters, often living in dire conditions. His financial struggles were exacerbated by his inability to secure stable employment, and he spent much of his time painting postcards and doing other odd jobs to survive. It was during this time that Hitler's views on politics, race, and nationalism began to crystallize. He was deeply influenced by the political climate in Vienna, which was dominated by anti-Semitic and nationalist ideas. He became a fervent admirer of the Pan-German movement, which advocated for the unification of all German-speaking peoples, and began to develop his ideas about the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. Adolf Hitler's exposure to the writings and ideas of individuals like Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, and Georg von Schönerer, a radical nationalist, played a significant role in shaping his later political ideology. Lueger's anti-Semitic rhetoric and emphasis on German nationalism resonated with Hitler, who would later adopt these ideas and incorporate them into his own political platform. During his time in Vienna, Hitler also developed a deep-seated hatred for Jews, whom he blamed for many of the social and economic problems in Austria and Germany. He viewed Jews as a parasitic race that was responsible for the perceived moral decay of European society. These beliefs would form the foundation of his later genocidal policies and his vision for the future of Germany and the world. 2. World War I, and entry into politics 1914 to 1920. Military service and experience in World War I. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Adolf Hitler was living in Munich, Germany. Despite being an Austrian citizen, he chose to enlist in the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, as he had no desire to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army. His decision to fight for Germany was rooted in his deep sense of German nationalism, and his belief that Germany represented the pinnacle of European civilization. Hitler was initially assigned to a reserve infantry regiment and served as a messenger, which involved delivering important messages across the front lines. His position in the regiment was relatively safe compared to the frontline combat roles, but he still experienced the brutal realities of warfare. Hitler was wounded twice during the war. In 1916, he was injured in the leg during the Battle of the Somme, and in 1918, he was temporarily blinded in a mustard gas attack during the final stages of the war. Despite the hardships he endured, Hitler received several military honors, including the Iron Cross First Class for bravery. This recognition reinforced his sense of personal pride and reinforced his belief in the strength and superiority of the German military. However, the war also left him with a deep sense of bitterness and anger, particularly regarding Germany's eventual defeat. Hitler would later claim that he had been deeply shocked by Germany's surrender, which he attributed to betrayal by civilians, particularly politicians and socialists. This sense of betrayal would become a central theme in his later political career. Wounded in battle and Iron Cross awards. During his time in the military, Hitler showed remarkable resilience. He received 2 Iron Cross awards, the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 for his bravery during the early stages of the war, and the Iron Cross First Class in 1918 for his actions during a dangerous mission in France. These decorations were highly prestigious in the German military and contributed to Hitler's growing sense of self-importance. Despite these accolades, Hitler's experiences in the war deeply affected him. He began to develop a strong sense of nationalism and resentment toward those he believed were responsible for Germany's defeat. This resentment would later fuel his political ideologies and drive his pursuit of power. Reaction to Germany's defeat and Treaty of Versailles. When Germany formally surrendered in November 1918, Hitler was devastated. He believed that the country's military defeat was not due to any lack of effort or bravery by the soldiers, but was instead caused by a stab in the back by civilians, particularly Jews, Marxists, and the political left. This belief in the betrayal of the German people by their own politicians became a core element of Hitler's ideology. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which officially ended the war, further fueled Hitler's anger. The treaty imposed harsh terms on Germany, including territorial losses, military restrictions, and the imposition of reparations. Hitler saw the treaty as a humiliating betrayal and a symbol of the weakness of the Weimar Republic, the democratic government that had been established in Germany after the war. He believed that Germany had been unfairly punished and that the country needed to be restored to its former glory. This desire for revenge and national revival would become the driving force behind his rise to power. Joining the German Workers' Party, DAP. In 1919, Adolf Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, DAP, a small nationalist and anti-Semitic political group in Munich. The party, which was founded by Anton Drexler and others, advocated for the unification of German-speaking peoples and the removal of Jews from German society. Hitler's membership in the DAP marked the beginning of his political career. Hitler's skills as an orator and propagandist quickly became apparent. He was able to captivate audiences with his passionate speeches and nationalist rhetoric, which resonated deeply with many Germans who were disillusioned by the Treaty of Versailles and the economic hardships of the post-war period. His ability to articulate the frustrations and fears of ordinary Germans helped him gain a loyal following. Hitler's rise within the DAP was rapid. In 1920, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or the Nazi Party, and Hitler became its chief spokesperson. The NSDAP adopted a radical platform that called for the abolition of the Treaty of Versailles, the restoration of Germany's military power, the expulsion of Jews, and the establishment of a totalitarian state. Hitler's charisma and powerful speeches helped the Nazi Party gain increasing attention, and by the early 1920s, the party had become a significant force in German politics. 3. Rise in the Nazi Party, and Munich Putsch 1921 to 1924. Transformation of DAP into the Nazi Party, NSDAP. By 1920, Adolf Hitler had become a central figure within the German Workers' Party, DAP. He had risen through the ranks due to his remarkable oratorical skills, charisma, and the growing nationalist sentiment in Germany, especially among those who felt betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles and the Weimar Republic. Hitler quickly realized that the small DAP needed a more powerful and more appealing platform to gain widespread support. In 1920, the DAP changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, which reflected the party's focus on national unity and its opposition to the perceived dangers of communism and Jewish influence in German society. Hitler played a key role in shaping the party's new ideology, which combined radical nationalism, anti-Semitism, and a call for a strong centralized state. The party also adopted the infamous swastika as its symbol, which would later become synonymous with the Nazi regime. By 1921, Hitler had become the most prominent figure in the NSDAP. His speeches, which attacked Jews, communists, and the Weimar government, resonated with many Germans who were dissatisfied with the political and economic instability in the country. Hitler was a powerful and charismatic speaker, capable of rallying large crowds and spreading the party's message of national rejuvenation and unity. His ability to channel the anger and frustration of ordinary Germans turned him into a political figure of considerable importance in a short period. Public speaking and propaganda strategies. One of Hitler's most significant contributions to the Nazi Party was his mastery of propaganda. Hitler understood the power of imagery, symbols, and rhetoric in shaping public opinion. He employed various methods of propaganda to spread his ideas and recruit supporters, including mass rallies, public speeches, posters, and the use of the media. Hitler's speeches were a central element of Nazi propaganda. He delivered them with great passion and intensity, often speaking for hours to large crowds. His ability to tap into the fears, frustrations, and hopes of his audience allowed him to connect with ordinary Germans on an emotional level. He spoke about the need to restore Germany's strength, eliminate the influence of Jews, and create a strong, unified nation. His speeches often depicted the Weimar government as weak and corrupt and portrayed the Treaty of Versailles as a humiliation that needed to be undone. The NSDAP also used symbols and imagery to create a sense of unity and purpose. The swastika became the party's emblem, representing the strength and unity of the German people. The party's propaganda also emphasized militarism, nationalism, and the idea of a new Germany that would rise from the ashes of the old Weimar Republic. This propaganda was incredibly effective in attracting a wide range of supporters, from disgruntled war veterans to the unemployed and nationalist intellectuals. The failed Beer Hall Putsch 1923. Despite the growing popularity of the Nazi Party, Hitler's rise to power was not without setbacks. By 1923, Hitler and the Nazi Party were dissatisfied with the political situation in Germany. The Weimar government was weak, and the country was experiencing severe economic crises, including hyperinflation and political instability. Hitler believed that the time had come for a radical change in government, and he decided to attempt a coup to seize power. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers launched what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup attempt in Munich. Hitler, along with his deputy Rudolf Hess and other Nazi leaders, tried to overthrow the Bavarian government and take control of the city. They believed that the political instability in Germany would make this an opportune moment to seize power. Hitler hoped that the military would support the Nazis in their effort to overthrow the government. However, the coup quickly faltered. The Nazi Party's forces were met with resistance from the Bavarian police, and the attempted coup ended in a dramatic confrontation. Hitler and his followers were arrested, and many of the party's leaders were imprisoned. Hitler was charged with treason and sentenced to 5 years in prison, although he would only serve about 9 months of his sentence. Trial and imprisonment. The Beer Hall Putsch was a failure, but it brought Hitler national attention. During his trial, Hitler used the court as a platform to promote his ideas and attack the Weimar government. He portrayed himself as a patriot fighting for the future of Germany and used the trial to further publicize his views on the Treaty of Versailles, the Jews, and the need for a strong German state. He argued that the German people had been betrayed by the government and that it was time for a new order to rise. Hitler's trial and subsequent imprisonment allowed him to reflect on his approach to gaining power. He realized that the path to power would not come through violent uprisings but through legal means and the support of the people. While in prison, Hitler wrote his autobiography and political manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which would become the blueprint for Nazi ideology. In Mein Kampf, Hitler outlined his vision for Germany's future, his belief in Aryan racial superiority, and his hatred of Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies of the German people. Mein Kampf and Political Strategy. While in prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, which would later become the cornerstone of Nazi ideology. The book was both an autobiography and a political manifesto. In it, Hitler laid out his views on race, the role of Jews in society, the concept of Lebensraum, living space for the German people, and his vision for a totalitarian state that would dominate Europe. Mein Kampf was not widely read during Hitler's time in prison, but it served as a foundation for the ideas that would guide the Nazi Party in the coming years. It called for the expansion of German territory to the east, the subjugation of Slavic peoples, and the extermination of Jews. Hitler also emphasized the need for a strong, centralized government that would restore Germany to its former greatness. The book also reflected Hitler's deep sense of victimhood, portraying him as a misunderstood genius who would one day lead Germany to glory. 4. Mein Kampf and Ideological Development 1924 to 1925. Writing Mein Kampf in prison. After his imprisonment following the failed Beer Hall Putsch, Adolf Hitler had ample time to reflect on his political future and strategy. During his time in Landsberg prison, Hitler decided to write a book that would outline his ideological beliefs, personal history, and future vision for Germany. This book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, was written over a period of about 2 years and was published in 2 volumes, in 1925 and 1927. Mein Kampf was both an autobiography and a political manifesto. In the book, Hitler shared his thoughts on the historical and political issues he considered essential to the future of Germany. The book, written in a straightforward and often inflammatory style, discussed his views on race, nationalism, anti-Semitism, and the perceived need for Germany to expand its territory. His deep resentment towards Jews, Marxists, and other groups was central to his writing, and his book provided a chilling blueprint for the genocidal policies that would later define his regime. Anti-Semitism and racial theories. Central to Mein Kampf was Hitler's belief in the racial superiority of the Aryan race. He described Aryans as the master race destined to rule over all other races. According to Hitler, Jews, Slavs, and other minorities were considered inferior races, and the Jews in particular were portrayed as the ultimate enemy of the German people. He blamed Jews for the spread of communism, the economic instability in Germany, and the social degradation of Europe. Hitler's anti-Semitism was not just based on a desire to isolate Jews from society, but on the belief that they represented an existential threat to the survival of the Aryan race. He saw Jews as an insidious force that had to be eliminated in order to preserve the purity of the German people. This ideology would lead to the eventual implementation of the final solution, the mass extermination of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. Lebensraum and expansionism. Another major theme in Mein Kampf was the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. Hitler argued that Germany needed to expand its territory to the east in order to provide room for its growing population and secure the future of the German people. He saw Eastern Europe as the key to fulfilling this need, and his plans included the conquest and colonization of vast areas of land in the Soviet Union. Hitler's concept of Lebensraum was closely linked to his racial ideology. He believed that the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe were inferior and would have to be subjugated or displaced to make way for German settlers. The idea of Lebensraum was not only about securing more territory but also about establishing German dominance over the region. This vision of territorial expansion would become one of the driving forces behind Hitler's aggressive foreign policy and the eventual outbreak of World War II. Political strategy and the road to power. While in prison, Hitler realized that achieving political power would require more than just violent uprisings. His failure in the Beer Hall Putsch had shown him that a coup was not the way forward. Instead, he began to advocate for the use of legal means to achieve power. This meant gaining popular support, building alliances with influential political figures, and using the Weimar Constitution to his advantage. In his writings, Hitler emphasized the need for a totalitarian government in which the leader, or Führer, held absolute power. He rejected democracy, which he saw as weak and corrupt, and advocated for the establishment of a dictatorial regime that would impose order and restore Germany to greatness. Hitler's vision of a totalitarian state was one in which the individual was subordinate to the needs of the nation, and the will of the Führer was absolute. This would later become a hallmark of Nazi rule. Rebuilding the Nazi Party. While Hitler was in prison, the Nazi Party went through a period of turmoil. Many of the party's leaders, including Rudolf Hess and other prominent figures, had been arrested alongside Hitler after the Beer Hall Putsch. The party's activities were severely restricted, and it was unclear whether it would survive the setback. However, Hitler's time in prison allowed him to reorganize and reassess the direction of the Nazi movement. In 1924, after his release from prison, Hitler began rebuilding the Nazi Party, which was still a marginal political group. He realized that the party would need to broaden its appeal and attract a larger base of supporters. His new strategy was to focus on gaining the support of the middle-class workers and veterans, many of whom were disillusioned by the failures of the Weimar Republic. Hitler also sought to establish ties with conservative and nationalist groups that were dissatisfied with the government. He cultivated relationships with wealthy industrialists, military leaders, and influential figures who could provide financial support and lend legitimacy to the Nazi movement. At the same time, Hitler worked to develop the Nazi Party's propaganda apparatus, organizing mass rallies, creating posters, and using the media to spread his message of national revival and unity. 5. Rise to power and consolidation of control 1925 to 1933. Return to politics, and the rebuilding of the Nazi Party. After being released from prison in December 1924, Adolf Hitler focused on rebuilding the Nazi Party. He recognized that the failure of the Beer Hall Putsch had shown the dangers of seeking power through violent means. Instead, Hitler decided that the way forward was through legal and political processes, working within the framework of the Weimar Republic to dismantle it from the inside. Hitler's time in prison had allowed him to reflect on his goals and strategies. He realized that the Nazi Party needed to expand its appeal beyond the radical fringe. He also recognized the importance of forging alliances with other nationalist and conservative factions within German politics. By focusing on popularizing his ideas, especially the promise of a strong, stable Germany free from the influence of communism and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler sought to position the Nazi Party as a mainstream political force. The Nazi Party in the late 1920s. After his release from prison, Hitler devoted himself to reviving the Nazi Party, which had been severely weakened by the failed putsch. He restructured the party's leadership and organized its activities in a more professional and disciplined manner. Hitler built a highly effective propaganda machine, using rallies, posters, newspapers, and speeches to gain support. The NSDAP's message of national revival, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism resonated with a wide range of Germans who were frustrated by the economic instability, unemployment, and political fragmentation of the Weimar Republic. One of the key factors in the Nazi Party's resurgence was the increasing political and economic instability of the Weimar Republic. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, hit Germany particularly hard. Unemployment soared and many Germans turned to extremist political parties, including the Communists and the Nazis, as they sought solutions to the economic crisis. The Nazis capitalized on the public's discontent by offering promises of jobs, national pride, and the restoration of order. The early 1930s saw the Nazi Party's growing presence in German politics. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, the Nazi Party gained only a small percentage of the vote, but this would change rapidly in the next few years. Hitler and the NSDAP were increasingly seen as a viable alternative to the failing Weimar government, especially as the economic crisis deepened and extremist political factions gained momentum. The Great Depression and Nazi electoral success. The onset of the Great Depression in 1929 was a turning point for the Nazi Party. The economic collapse led to mass unemployment, widespread poverty, and social unrest in Germany. Many people who had previously supported moderate or center-right parties began to lose faith in the Weimar Republic and its ability to solve the country's problems. In this climate of frustration and disillusionment, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis offered a message of hope and restoration. Hitler's promises of national unity, economic recovery, and the creation of jobs resonated with the German people. The Nazi Party capitalized on the fear of communism, presenting itself as the only force capable of protecting Germany from a Marxist revolution. They also blamed Jews and other minorities for the country's economic woes, tapping into long-standing anti-Semitic sentiments in the population. In the 1930 Reichstag elections, the Nazi Party made a stunning breakthrough, receiving 18.3% of the vote and becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag, behind the Social Democrats. This was a major milestone in the party's rise to power. By 1932, the Nazis had become the largest political party in Germany with more than 37% of the vote in the Reichstag elections. This success was not just due to Hitler's personal charisma, but also to the party's effective use of propaganda, mass rallies, and a disciplined organizational structure. Hitler's appointment as chancellor. Despite their growing electoral success, the Nazis did not yet have an absolute majority in the Reichstag. Hitler faced significant resistance from established political elites, including President Paul von Hindenburg and other conservative figures who were wary of Hitler's radical agenda and authoritarian tendencies. However, Hitler's electoral success and the growing political instability of the Weimar Republic made it increasingly difficult for these elites to ignore him. In January 1933, after a series of backroom deals and political maneuvering, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. This was a pivotal moment in German history. Although Hitler was not yet in full control of the government, his appointment gave him a position of tremendous influence, and he would use this position to rapidly consolidate power in the following months. The Reichstag fire and the Reichstag fire decree. Just weeks after Hitler became Chancellor, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, was set on fire on February 27, 1933. The Nazis immediately blamed the communists, claiming that the fire was part of a larger plot to overthrow the government. Hitler used the Reichstag fire as a pretext to push through the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended many civil liberties, including freedom of speech, the press, and assembly. The decree also allowed for the arrest of political opponents, especially communists and socialists. The Reichstag fire decree marked the beginning of the Nazi Party's rapid move toward totalitarian rule. Hitler and the Nazis used the fire as a justification for suppressing political opposition and silencing dissent. The Communist Party was banned, and many of its leaders were arrested. The Social Democrats, the last major opposition party, were also weakened. By March 1933, Hitler had effectively neutralized most of his political opponents, paving the way for the next phase of his consolidation of power. The Enabling Act and the establishment of dictatorship. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler the authority to enact laws without the approval of the Reichstag or the president. This act effectively gave Hitler dictatorial powers, allowing him to rule by decree. With the passage of the Enabling Act, the last vestiges of democracy in Germany were eliminated, and Hitler became the absolute ruler of the country. The Enabling Act was passed with the support of the Nazis and their allies, but it was also the result of intense political pressure and intimidation. Many members of the Reichstag were coerced or threatened into voting for the act. The passage of the Enabling Act marked the official end of the Weimar Republic and the beginning of Nazi dictatorship. Hitler now had the legal authority to implement his radical policies, which would lead to the transformation of Germany into a totalitarian state. The Night of the Long Knives. In the summer of 1934, Hitler sought to eliminate any remaining threats to his power, both within the Nazi Party and in the broader political landscape. The most significant challenge came from the Sturmabteilung, a paramilitary organization that had helped Hitler rise to power but was now seen as a potential rival. The leader of the SA, Ernst Röhm, and many of his followers had advocated for more radical policies, including a second revolution to redistribute wealth and strengthen the working class. Röhm's ambitions and the growing power of the SA alarmed Hitler, who saw the organization as a potential threat to his control. On June 30, 1934, Hitler ordered a purge of the SA leadership, known as the Night of the Long Knives. Rome and many of his followers were arrested and executed, solidifying Hitler's control over the Nazi Party and ensuring that the SS Schutzstaffel, led by Heinrich Himmler, would become the dominant force in the Nazi regime. The Night of the Long Knives further consolidated Hitler's power and eliminated any potential rivals within the Nazi movement. 6. Nazi consolidation of power and the outbreak of World War II 1933 to 1939. Totalitarian control and the creation of a Nazi state. Once Hitler had consolidated his political power, he and his regime moved quickly to transform Germany into a totalitarian state. The Enabling Act of March 1933 had already granted him dictatorial powers, and over the next few years, the Nazi government took measures to ensure that no opposition could emerge to challenge their authority. The Nazi state became a highly centralized, repressive, and authoritarian regime that controlled every aspect of public life. A central element of this totalitarian control was the elimination of political opposition. The Nazis systematically dismantled the political structures of the Weimar Republic, including democratic institutions such as political parties, independent labor unions, and the press. The Communist Party had already been banned, and the Social Democrats were also crushed by the Nazis. By 1935, the Reichstag had become a rubber stamp institution, with the Nazis holding complete control over legislation. The Gestapo, the secret police, and the SS, the paramilitary arm of the Nazi Party, played a crucial role in maintaining control over the population. These organizations were responsible for spying on and arresting anyone suspected of disloyalty to the regime. The Nazis also established a vast network of concentration camps to imprison political opponents, Jews, homosexuals, and other marginalized groups. Through this system of repression and terror, Hitler ensured that dissent was silenced and fear ruled the country. The Nuremberg Laws and the persecution of Jews. One of the most significant steps in the consolidation of Nazi power was the implementation of a series of laws that targeted Jews and other minority groups. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were passed, which laid the legal groundwork for the systemic persecution of Jews in Germany. These laws were designed to isolate and segregate Jews from the rest of society, stripping them of their citizenship and rights. The Nuremberg Laws defined who was considered Jewish based on racial criteria, and they prohibited intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. Jews were also banned from holding public office, practicing law or medicine, and working in many professions. This marked the beginning of the Nazi regime's formalized anti-Semitic policies, which would escalate into the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. In addition to Jews, other minority groups such as Roma, Gypsies, homosexuals, disabled individuals, and political dissidents were persecuted. The Nazis considered these groups to be undesirable and sought to eliminate them from German society. The expansion of the Third Reich. As part of his broader vision for a greater Germany, Hitler sought to expand Germany's territory and establish a dominant position in Europe. He believed that this was essential for securing the future of the German people and ensuring the success of the Nazi state. The idea of Lebensraum, living space, was central to Hitler's expansionist plans, and he focused on conquering territories in the east to provide space for German settlers and to exploit resources. The first significant move in this direction came in 1936, when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles. This bold move was a direct challenge to the Versailles Treaty and was an early indication of Hitler's willingness to defy international agreements. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was met with little resistance from the Western powers, which emboldened Hitler and set the stage for further aggression. The Munich Agreement and the annexation of Austria 1938. In 1938, Hitler's expansionism took another significant step forward with the annexation of Austria, the Anschluss. Austria had been a German-speaking country, and Hitler believed that the annexation of Austria would fulfill the goal of uniting all German-speaking people under one government. The move was popular in both Austria and Germany, but it was also a violation of the Treaty of Versailles and an act of aggression toward other European powers. Following the Anschluss, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, particularly the region of Sudetenland, which had a significant German-speaking population. In September 1938, Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia cede Sudetenland to Germany. The crisis over Sudetenland led to the Munich Agreement signed by Hitler, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. The agreement allowed Germany to annex Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial expansion. The Munich Agreement is often cited as an example of appeasement, a policy of conceding to Hitler's demands in an attempt to avoid war. It was hoped that by giving in to some of Hitler's territorial demands, war could be avoided. However, the agreement only emboldened Hitler and made it clear that the Western powers were not willing to confront his expansionist ambitions. The Pact of Steel and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. As Hitler's aggression grew, Germany began to form alliances with other authoritarian regimes. In 1939, Germany and Italy signed the Pact of Steel, a military and political alliance that cemented their cooperation. This alliance was later joined by Japan, forming the Axis powers. One of the most shocking developments of 1939 was the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union. The pact, named after the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, was a non-aggression treaty between the two countries. The pact also secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowing both countries to expand their territories without interference from the other. The outbreak of World War II. Hitler's territorial ambitions finally led to the outbreak of World War II on September 1, 1939. Germany invaded Poland, triggering the war. The invasion was a direct result of Hitler's desire for more territory and resources, as well as his belief that the Versailles Treaty had unjustly limited Germany's power. In response to the invasion, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. This marked the official beginning of World War II. The war would involve countries from all over the world, leading to the deaths of millions and fundamentally altering the course of history. 7. World War II and early Nazi victories 1939 to 1941. The Blitzkrieg and the invasion of France. The early stages of World War II saw a series of dramatic and unexpected military victories for Nazi Germany. The strategy employed by the Nazis was known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, which emphasized rapid, highly coordinated attacks involving infantry, tanks, and air support. The goal of Blitzkrieg was to overwhelm the enemy quickly and decisively, leaving little time for organized resistance. Following the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, which marked the beginning of the war, Hitler turned his attention to the West. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, securing vital strategic positions in Northern Europe. However, the most significant and dramatic victory came in the invasion of France in May 1940. Germany's attack on France was a shock to the world. In just 6 weeks, the German forces bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by advancing through Belgium and the Ardennes Forest, which the French had believed to be impassable for large mechanized armies. The French military, unprepared for this kind of warfare, was quickly overwhelmed. By June 14, 1940, Paris fell to the Germans, and France surrendered on June 22, 1940. The fall of France was a stunning defeat for the Allies and a major victory for Hitler. The rapid success of the Blitzkrieg strategy led to the occupation of much of Western Europe, and Germany now controlled large portions of the continent, including Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and France. The Battle of Britain and the failure of the Luftwaffe. After the fall of France, Hitler turned his attention to Britain, the last major European power still resisting Nazi expansion. In July 1940, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, to launch an aerial bombing campaign against Britain, with the goal of weakening the British military and breaking the will of the British people. The Battle of Britain marked the first major military campaign to be fought entirely by air forces. The Luftwaffe strategy was to destroy Britain's air defenses, including radar stations and air bases, to pave the way for a German invasion. However, the British Royal Air Force RAF proved to be a formidable opponent. The British used a combination of radar technology, tactical skill, and determination to repel the German attacks. In addition, the Luftwaffe's failure to gain air superiority over Britain was a key factor in the failure of Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's planned invasion of Britain. The Battle of Britain, fought between July and October 1940, ended in a decisive German defeat. The failure of the Luftwaffe to achieve its objectives marked the first major setback for Hitler's military campaigns. Despite this, Germany continued its war efforts, focusing on other fronts in the east and south. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. One of the most ambitious and catastrophic decisions made by Hitler was the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The operation, known as Operation Barbarossa, was a massive military campaign aimed at defeating the Soviet Union and acquiring its vast resources, particularly oil fields in the Caucasus. Hitler had long harbored a deep hatred of the Soviet regime and viewed the war with the Soviet Union as a racial struggle for Lebensraum, living space for the German people. The German invasion began on June 22, 1941, and initially the Wehrmacht made rapid gains. German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast amounts of land and causing the Soviet military to retreat in disarray. However, the campaign soon encountered significant difficulties. The vast size of the Soviet Union, the harsh weather conditions, and the resilience of the Soviet people and military created a challenging environment for the German forces. Despite initial successes, the German advance stalled as the winter months set in and the Soviet Union began to regroup and launch counterattacks. The Germans had underestimated the logistical challenges of the campaign, and they were not prepared for the bitter cold and the vast distances involved. The failure to capture Moscow in the winter of 1941 was a major setback for Hitler and marked the beginning of a long and bloody war of attrition in the east. The Siege of Leningrad, and the Battle of Stalingrad. As Operation Barbarossa faltered, the Germans laid siege to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, one of the Soviet Union's most important cities. The Siege of Leningrad, which lasted from September 1941 to January 1944, was one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history. The city was encircled by German forces, and the inhabitants faced extreme starvation, disease, and bombardment. Despite the suffering, the Soviet defenders refused to surrender, and the siege ultimately failed. The German failure to capture Leningrad and other key Soviet cities, combined with a harsh winter, forced the German military to abandon its advance in the east. One of the most significant turning points of the war came in 1942, with the Battle of Stalingrad. The battle was fought for control of the southern Soviet city of Stalingrad, a major industrial center on the Volga River. The Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resistance and determination. The Germans suffered heavy casualties and were eventually surrounded by Soviet forces. After months of brutal urban warfare, the German Sixth Army was forced to surrender in February 1943, marking a decisive turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The loss of Stalingrad was a catastrophic blow to the German war effort and marked the beginning of a long Soviet counteroffensive that would eventually drive the Nazis out of Eastern Europe. The United States enters the war. Although the United States had remained neutral at the beginning of the war, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese on December 7, 1941, led to the United States' formal entry into World War II. The attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet brought the United States into conflict with Japan, and soon after, Nazi Germany declared war on the United States in solidarity with its Axis partner Japan. The entry of the United States into the war significantly altered the balance of power. The U.S. provided crucial military and economic support to the Allies, particularly through the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to send weapons, supplies, and aid to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations. American involvement would prove to be a decisive factor in the eventual defeat of the Axis powers. The war in Africa and the Mediterranean. While the Eastern Front and Western Europe were the main theaters of the war, the conflict also spread to other regions, including North Africa and the Mediterranean. In North Africa, German forces under the command of Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, fought against British and Commonwealth forces. The campaign in North Africa saw a series of dramatic battles, culminating in the Allied victory at El Alamein in 1942. In the Mediterranean, Hitler's forces were involved in a series of campaigns, including the invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia in 1941. These operations were aimed at securing the Balkans and providing support for the Axis powers in North Africa. However, the Allies' ability to fight on multiple fronts, coupled with growing resistance in occupied territories, made it increasingly difficult for Germany to maintain its territorial gains. 8. Strategic shifts and Nazi defeats 1942 to 1943. the Battle of Midway, and the turning of the tide in the Pacific. In the summer of 1942, the tide of war began to shift against the Axis powers, starting in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway, June 1942, marked a decisive turning point in the Pacific War. The United States, with the help of cryptography and intelligence, was able to ambush and destroy a large portion of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers dealt a critical blow to Japan's naval strength, and from that moment on, the Japanese were forced to adopt a defensive strategy. The victory at Midway provided the Allies with a strategic advantage and halted Japan's expansion in the Pacific. The defeat at Midway signaled the beginning of the decline of Japanese imperial ambitions as the United States and its allies gradually began to push back against Japanese forces throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Battle of Stalingrad and the Soviet counteroffensive. On the Eastern Front, the defeat of the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943 marked one of the most significant turning points of the entire war. Stalingrad was a critical industrial city located on the Volga River. For Hitler, its capture was symbolic and militarily important, as it would weaken Soviet industry and morale. The battle became a brutal, months-long urban warfare fight, characterized by heavy casualties and extreme hardship. By the end of January 1943, the German Sixth Army, which had been encircled by Soviet forces, was forced to surrender. This marked the first major defeat for the Nazis in the war and shattered Hitler's vision of a quick victory in the East. The loss at Stalingrad had profound strategic consequences as it allowed the Soviet Union to launch a massive counteroffensive, pushing German forces westward. Soviet forces began liberating vast areas of Soviet territory that had been occupied by Germany since the summer of 1941. The Battle of El Alamein and the North African Campaign. In North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein in October-November 1942 was another decisive turning point. The British Eighth Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, halted the German advance under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been threatening Egypt and the Suez Canal. This victory, along with the subsequent Allied invasion of French North Africa, Operation Torch in November 1942, forced the Axis forces to retreat from North Africa. The success in North Africa marked the beginning of the Allied push toward Italy and the southern underbelly of Europe. The defeat of the Germans in North Africa also removed a critical base of operations that could have been used to threaten the Middle East and the oil fields in the Caucasus. The Italian campaign and the fall of Mussolini. After the success in North Africa, the Allies turned their attention to Italy. Italy had been a member of the Axis powers, but by 1943 its military had been severely weakened, and there was growing discontent with Mussolini's fascist regime. The Allies launched an invasion of Sicily in July 1943, followed by a mainland invasion in September. The rapid collapse of Italian defenses, coupled with the growing pressure on Mussolini's government, led to the overthrow of Mussolini on July 25, 1943. Mussolini was arrested and eventually rescued by German forces, but his political power was effectively destroyed. With Mussolini out of power, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies in September 1943, and the country was officially out of the war. However, this did not mean peace in Italy. Germany quickly occupied northern and central Italy, leading to a bitter and prolonged campaign for control of the country. The Allied invasion of Italy marked the start of the Italian campaign, a difficult and costly effort that tied down German resources for much of the remainder of the war. The Nazi defeat in the Soviet Union and the Battle of Kursk. In 1943, the Soviet Union continued its push westward after the victory at Stalingrad. One of the key battles in this campaign was the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, which became the largest tank battle in history. Hitler, eager to regain the initiative in the east, launched a massive offensive against the Soviet forces. However, the Germans were met with fierce resistance, and the Soviet Red Army was able to repel the German assault. The defeat at Kursk marked the end of German offensives on the Eastern Front. From that point on, the Soviet forces took the initiative, and the Germans were on the defensive. The Battle of Kursk was a crushing blow to Nazi Germany, as it destroyed much of their armored forces and severely weakened their ability to wage offensive operations. The victory at Kursk marked another significant step toward the eventual Soviet liberation of Eastern Europe. the Allied bombing campaign, and the destruction of German cities. While the Germans were facing military setbacks on multiple fronts, the Allies intensified their air campaign against Nazi Germany. The Royal Air Force RAF and the United States Army Air Forces USAF launched a sustained bombing campaign against German cities and industrial centers. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were heavily bombed, causing widespread destruction and civilian casualties. The bombing campaign aimed to weaken Germany's war economy and morale. While it did not immediately cripple Germany's military capabilities, it placed immense strain on the German population and caused significant disruption to the war effort. The bombing raids also played a key role in the eventual collapse of the Nazi regime, as they helped to break the will of the German people and disrupt the production of weapons and other supplies. The Battle of the Atlantic and the strategic importance of the U-boat war. One of the most critical battles of World War II was the Battle of the Atlantic, which stretched over the entire course of the war. Germany's primary weapon in this battle was the U-boat submarine, which they used to disrupt the supply lines between the United States and Great Britain. The German U-boats targeted merchant convoys, aiming to cut off vital supplies of food, oil, and military equipment. In the early years of the war, the U-boats inflicted heavy losses on Allied shipping, but by 1943 the Allies had developed effective countermeasures including sonar, depth charges, and convoy systems. As a result, the tide turned in favor of the Allies, and German submarine forces began to suffer devastating losses. The defeat of Germany's U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was a key factor in ensuring the success of the Allied war effort, as it allowed the Allies to maintain the flow of supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union, which were critical to their war economies. The shift to Allied offensive operations. By 1943, the Allies had gained the initiative on both the Eastern and Western fronts. The Soviet Union was pushing German forces out of Eastern Europe, while the Allies were beginning to launch offensives in Italy and France. The United States and Great Britain also began planning the invasion of France, which would become known as D-Day Operation Overlord. The shift from defensive to offensive operations marked a new phase in the war, one in which the Axis powers were increasingly on the defensive. The Allies were now poised to launch a series of offensives that would lead to the liberation of Western Europe and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. 9. The final assault on Germany and the fall of the Nazis 1944 to 1945. The D-Day invasion and the liberation of France. The most significant turning point in the Western Front came with D-Day, the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. This was the largest amphibious assault in history, involving the landing of 156,000 American, British, Canadian, and Free French troops on the beaches of Normandy, France. The operation, codenamed Operation Overlord, was a decisive move in the Allies' plan to open a second front in Western Europe, which had been delayed for years. The invasion was a success despite initial heavy resistance from German forces. The landing allowed the Allies to establish a foothold in Normandy, and within a few weeks they had secured much of northern France. The liberation of Paris followed in August 1944, marking a significant blow to Nazi control in Western Europe. From that point on, the Allies rapidly advanced through France and Belgium, liberating towns and cities from German occupation. The success of the D-Day invasion was a turning point, as it opened the door to the liberation of Western Europe and forced the Germans to fight a war on multiple fronts. Hitler's forces, stretched thin by the Soviet advance in the east and the Allied push in the west, were no longer able to hold their ground effectively. The Battle of the Bulge and the last German offensive. In December 1944, Hitler launched one final major offensive in the west, known as the Battle of the Bulge. This was Germany's last attempt to break through the Allied lines and regain the initiative. The Germans launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, hoping to encircle and destroy 4 Allied armies. The offensive caught the Allies off guard, but despite initial successes, the German forces were unable to sustain their push. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during the war. While the Germans made initial gains, the Allies quickly regrouped and counterattacked. The battle ended in a decisive defeat for Germany, with the loss of vital resources, manpower, and equipment. The failure of the Battle of the Bulge marked the end of German offensive capabilities in the West, and from that point on the Allies had the upper hand. The Soviet push and the fall of Berlin. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union continued its relentless advance westward. By January 1945, Soviet forces had breached the Vistula River and were advancing into Germany. The Red Army launched a series of offensives, pushing German forces back and liberating large parts of Eastern Europe. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad and the subsequent battles in Ukraine and Poland had weakened Germany's ability to defend its eastern territories. By April 1945, the Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. The Germans, under Hitler's command, tried to defend the city, but it was clear that the war was lost. The Soviet siege of Berlin began in earnest, and the Germans were overwhelmed by the sheer size of the Soviet assault. The final battle for Berlin was fierce and bloody, with heavy casualties on both sides. The city was surrounded and bombarded, and by May 2, 1945, Soviet forces had taken control of the capital. Hitler's death, and the collapse of the Third Reich. As Soviet troops closed in on Berlin, Adolf Hitler, trapped in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, faced the inevitable collapse of his regime. On April 30, 1945, Hitler, realizing that all was lost, committed suicide along with his wife, Eva Braun, in his bunker. His death marked the end of the Nazi leadership and the collapse of the Third Reich. Following Hitler's death, the Nazi government was in disarray. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, who was appointed as Hitler's successor, attempted to negotiate a peace with the Allies, but by then Germany's defeat was certain. The German military continued to resist, but the end was imminent. Germany's surrender and the end of the war in Europe. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, marking the end of the war in Europe. The formal surrender took place in Reims, France, and was signed by German representatives. However, the surrender was not fully enacted until May 8, 1945, which is celebrated as Victory in Europe Day V-Day. The defeat of Nazi Germany was a momentous occasion, bringing an end to the brutal war in Europe that had claimed millions of lives. Despite the surrender, the war continued in the Pacific against Japan. The defeat of Nazi Germany, however, marked the end of Hitler's vision of world domination and the destruction of the Nazi regime. The Nuremberg trials and the accountability of Nazi leaders. Following the war, the Allies took steps to hold the leaders of Nazi Germany accountable for their crimes. The Nuremberg trials, which took place from November 1945 to October 1946, were a series of military tribunals held to prosecute key Nazi officials for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other atrocities committed during the war. 12 of the top Nazi leaders were sentenced to death by hanging, while others received long prison sentences. The Nuremberg trials were a landmark moment in international law, establishing the principle that individuals could be held accountable for war crimes, regardless of their position or rank within the government. The trials also exposed the full extent of the horrors of the Holocaust and the brutality of the Nazi regime. The aftermath of the war and the division of Germany. After the war, Europe was left in ruins. Millions of people had been killed and entire cities were destroyed. Germany was left devastated, and its economy was in shambles. The post-war settlement led to the division of Germany into East Germany and West Germany, with the eastern portion falling under Soviet influence and the western portion becoming a democratic republic supported by the United States, Great Britain, and France. The consequences of World War II would shape the geopolitics of the Cold War, as the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States became the dominant theme of global politics in the post-war era. The fall of Nazi Germany marked the end of one of history's most destructive and totalitarian regimes, but the scars of the war would be felt for generations. 10. The Nuremberg trials 1945 to 1946 were a series of military tribunals held after World War II to prosecute top Nazi officials for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. These trials were conducted by the Allied powers, including the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. The main trials took place in Nuremberg, Germany, where prominent figures such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop were tried for their roles in the Holocaust and other atrocities. The defendants were charged under 4 categories: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. The trials were groundbreaking in establishing individual responsibility for such crimes, marking the first time that individuals were held accountable for atrocities, even if they were following orders. The trials had a lasting impact on international law, establishing the Nuremberg Principles, which set the groundwork for later international criminal law. The trials exposed the extent of Nazi crimes, including the Holocaust, and underscored the importance of justice and accountability in preventing future atrocities. Despite some criticism, the Nuremberg trials remain a pivotal moment in the development of human rights and international justice.